Hello, this is Jacqueline from Jack Knits. Today we're going to learn how to do the pinhole cast on. Now this cast on method is perfect if you are starting a knitting project in the round where you're casting on only a couple stitches to begin with and then quickly doing several increases to begin your circular project. It's used often when you are working top-down hat circular or toe-up socks where you want to start with very few stitches. Now this pinhole cast on will allow you to do that, but not leave a big gaping hole in the center. You're able to cinch that hole up nice and tight so you have just a pinhole of a start to your knitting. So I'm going to show you how to do this in a couple different ways. Let's begin. Right, I'm going to show you how to do this pinhole cast on two different ways. The first way is using knitting needles to do your cast on, and the second way is a much easier method for many of you, and that is with using a crochet hook. The knitting needles is a little bit more persnickety and be a little bit more awkward to do. That's why I wanted to show you the little bit easier way of a crochet hook method as well for those who want that little bit of an easier option. Now, when I'm done showing you this cast on method, I'm also going to demonstrate two ways to begin knitting in the round after you've completed this cast on, either by using double pointed needles or by using a long circular needle and using the magic loop. So after I show you the cast on method, I'll show you how to transition to fully working in the round. Let's start by working with our knitting needles for this cast on. We're going to begin with a very short tail. You don't need a long tail at all. We're just going to start by making a large loop by bringing the working yarn up over the tail end of your yarn so you've got one large loop. Then we're going to take that working yarn and peek it through behind your loop so you can see that yarn running through the back of your loop. Pick that up with your knitting needle and bring it to the top. Now we're going to grab that working yarn and kind of bring it to the back because this is the yarn we're going to work with, that working yarn. I hold it in my left hand because I'm a continental knitter. Now if you are an English style knitter, you would put the yarn in your right hand and do all the maneuvers that way with your yarn in your right hand. I'm going to demonstrate it continental style, so my yarn is in my left hand. Now this cast on is a two-step process. This first step we've really pretty much already completed by kind of grabbing that yarn and putting one loop on our needle. So that was step one, and I'll show you that again when we come back to step one, but let me show you now step two, which is simply doing a yarn over. Now you can do the yarn over either way, either direction, either like this or like this. Doesn't matter, just be consistent throughout, okay? So after my yarn over, I'm going to take this first stitch and pass it over that yarn over. So to do that, I'm simply going to grab this stitch with my fingers here and pass it over that yarn over. Okay, so that's kind of the tricky part. It's a little hard to finagle some of you, so that's why this one is a little bit more persnickety. So that was step two. Let's go back to our step one, which is again just kind of grabbing this yarn and bringing it through this loop underneath both my working yarn and the tail here. So let's stick our needle through that center and pick up that yarn and bring it up. Okay, so that's step one again. Now step two is to do my yarn over. And now we're going to again pass this stitch over my yarn over by squeezing that stitch with my fingers and passing it over that yarn over. Okay, so now I've got two stitches for my pinhole cast on. Let's do another one by doing step one, bringing that needle through that loop, picking up that yarn behind it. Now we'll do a yarn over, and again pick up this stitch with our fingers and pass it over that yarn over. All right, let's do a couple more. Insert into the hole, grab that yarn, do a yarn over, grab that stitch with our fingers and pass it over. 4 stitches in that hole, pick up that yarn, yarn over, and pass that stitch over. All right, so that's 6 stitches on our needle. You would continue to do that for how many stitches your pattern would call for, perhaps 8 or just only 6. Okay, so now that you've got your stitches on your needle, now you can take your tail, and if you just give it a little tug, it will close up that hole. Now you don't have to close it up all the way right now. You can wait and close it up after you've done your first round of knitting or so, but eventually you'll be able to just close that all the way up so there is absolutely no gap there. Okay, so that is how you do it with a knitting needle. Now, if you didn't like that movement of pinching that stitch and bringing it over, let me show you a second way to do it with a crochet hook. We're going to start out the exact same way with this tail, and we're going to make that same loop we did before, bringing our yarn over top of our existing yarn here, the tail here, bringing that yarn behind, and this time we'll grab our crochet hook and pick up that yarn with our crochet hook. Bring that working yarn towards the back. That's what we're going to work with. And that is our step 1. Step 2 is going to be a yarn over the crochet hook now. And now because we've got a hook at the end of our needle, we can just simply bring that yarn through that loop on our hook, and we don't have to pick that up with our fingers. So much easier. All right, let's go to step 1, which is inserting that hook into that big loop, grabbing that yarn, bringing it back through, doing a yarn over, and then just hooking that yarn through that first stitch on our hook. There's 2. Let's do it again. Insert the hook, grab that yarn, bring it through, yarn over, and bring it through that first stitch. So this is quite simple to do. It doesn't take a lot of maneuvering around with your fingers. If you are a crocheter, you're probably instantly recognizing this as the magic ring method, and you are absolutely correct. This is exactly what you do with a magic ring if you are a crocheter. The only difference is that we're not completing that last step of a crochet stitch, but we're keeping all of these loops on our crochet needle. Okay, so if you're a crocheter, you're kind of following along with me and going, hey, this looks familiar. Okay, so now I've got, let's do another one. I've got 8 of them on. So that is one way. Again, you're going to cinch this shut. Now, not all the way, probably initially. Now, of course, we've got our stitches on our crochet hook. We need to now just transfer them to a knitting needle in order to continue our knitting project. Since we're not crocheting, we're knitting this. So now we just simply move stitches to one to the other. Now I've got a straight crochet hook, so I could, if I wanted to, just slide these stitches down and just slip them off the crochet hook onto my knitting needle. But if your crochet hook has one of those really chunky handles, then you'll have to do it from the other direction. So just take your knitting needle and just slip that stitch off your crochet hook and to the knitting needle, and just unhook it from your crochet hook and continue to do each of those stitches that way. Just unhook it from your crochet hook, slip each stitch onto your knitting needle so we can begin knitting in the round. Okay, so now that the stitches are on my knitting needle, I can, if you'd like, close this up a little bit further, and we can begin to work in the round. All right, I wanted to just continue here and just give a little demonstration on how to proceed from here, because many of you struggled, as I did for quite a bit, on starting your work with double pointed needles when you only have a few stitches casted on. So now we've successfully did our pinhole cast on, but what do we do next? So I want to show you how to start with double pointed needles and do it the most simplest of ways. Okay, so I've got 8 stitches on one DPN. I'm going to now just transfer half of them, 4 of them, to a second DPN. So let's just slip 4 stitches from the first needle to the second needle. And so now I've got them on 2 different needles. Now at this point, I can pull that tail snugly to close up my hole, get my pinhole there. And now I've got 4 stitches on each of 2 DPNs. Now the working yarn is coming off of my top DPN here, and this is what the yarn I'm going to start to use to knit with. Normally when you work with DPNs, you're having your stitches on 3 DPNs and you're knitting with a 4th one. I'm going to, however, begin my first row only working with these 2 DPNs with stitches and knitting with my 3rd one. The reason for that is that if you have them on 3 needles, these stitches, you only have like 2 or 3 stitches on each needle, and it's very easy to let those needles slide out of those stitches because you're just working with too many needles and too few stitches. So what I like to do is just knit my first round with only the stitches on 2 needles. So this is how we're going to do that. I am going to take my working yarn off of the needle on my right, and I'm going to start knitting the stitches from my needle on the left with my empty 3rd DPN. So we'll just start to knit now these stitches right here. These stitches are just going to hang on here for just a moment. Now normally when you're knitting like this in the round and you're doing this first round, you're going to do a lot of increases in order for your hole to greatly expand outward. So many times pattern calls for doing like a knit in the front and back of every stitch to greatly increase your stitch count right off the bat. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to knit in the front and back of each stitch for this first row or round. So I'm just taking my 3rd needle and knitting the stitches off of one of those DPNs, knitting in the front and back of each of these 4 stitches. That's going to double my stitch count here, which is good. That's going to give us more stitches to work with, make it a little bit easier. Okay, so now that I've gotten those stitches stitched, I'm going to turn my work. I now have a new empty DPN. Now let's knit the 4 stitches on the 2nd DPN. So I'll knit in the front and back of each of these stitches as well. Okay, so now here's my empty needle. I've got 8 stitches on both needles. And now, since I've got more stitches on my needles, I've got a row underneath my belt, I can incorporate another DPN. Okay, so here's how we'll incorporate that 4th DPN. I'm going to first start with my empty 3rd one and begin knitting just a few stitches off of this first double pointed needle here. So I'm going to now for this round just knit all of my stitches. I won't do any increases at this time. So let's just begin knitting these stitches, but I'm not going to knit all the way across. I'm just going to knit, let's just knit 5 of these stitches off of this needle for now. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Now I'm going to incorporate my next needle, and I will knit the remainder 3 stitches from this needle. Now I've got more needles that are kind of in the way here, but just let those other 2 needles kind of dangle there. Excuse the noise as they hit my desk. Now that I'm done with those 3 needles, let's just for a moment set down this empty one, continue to knit with this needle, put this tail in the back here, just a few of the stitches off the next needle. So let's knit 3 stitches off of this next needle. 1, 2, and 3. Now I've got 3 needles with stitches on, so now I can take my empty 4th needle to knit the remainder stitches of this one, okay? So what I'm doing here basically is just adding that 3rd needle, kind of dividing those needles or those stitches up between all 3 of these needles. So now I can continue to, like you do when you work with double pointed needles, have my stitches on 3 double pointed needles and using my 4th needle to knit. So now that I've successfully transferred them all, I can just knit my next round. That might include some more increases, and I can continue to knit in the round with my double pointed needles. So that's the transition from the pinhole cast on to knitting with double pointed needles. Let's take a look next on how to do it for a magic loop. All right, let's use our long circular needle to knit with the magic loop method, but we'll start with our pinhole cast on. So I'm going to use the crochet hook method to just begin our pinhole cast on. I'm not going to explain these steps as I did this earlier. So let me just quickly put 8 stitches onto my crochet hook and then I'll transfer them to my long circular needle. All right, I've got 8 stitches that I casted on with a pinhole cast on method, and now I'm going to transfer them to my long circular needle. Needle in my left hand, and again, I'm just going to switch them from my needle, unhook the crochet hook, and get them all on one tip of my circular needle. All right, so now they're on my circular needle, and let's begin the magic loop method. So if you'd like, you can pull on your tail here and tighten it up a little bit. I'm going to tighten it up further as I go to set up. So let's bring these stitches over onto our cable here. Now, if you want a more further detailed explanation on the magic loop, I encourage you to watch my other video on the magic loop method. That just goes through it much slower and easier. You can follow along if you need a little refresher. But I'm just going to show you pretty quickly here how to begin with the magic loop. So we've got our 8 stitches on our cable here. I'm going to halfway between my stitches, so in between my 4th and 5th stitch, I'm going to bend my cable so I can pull these stitches out and slide them to the tips of my circular needle. Okay, so now I've got both sets of stitches on the ends, my tips of my needle, and now I can take this tail again and cinch this all the way close so I have no gap there in the middle, okay? So now our 2 sides are connected. My tail is here. This one I can just kind of ignore. My working yarn I want to bring up in between my 2 needles and drape over my back one. That's going to be my working yarn that I'm going to use. Again, since I'm continental knitter, I'm going to put it in my left hand, my working yarn in my left hand. Now we're going to knit the stitches from this front needle with the tip needle of our back needle, okay? So to do that, I'm going to pull out this tip, pull out this needle about halfway, and so I have enough room to now knit the stitches on this needle. So again, I'm going to start by knitting in the front and back of each stitch so I can greatly increase my stitch count, which is what you will most likely do in some form or another when you start working in the round and starting with just a few stitches. So I'm knitting the front and back of each of these stitches on this side of my needle. When I get to the end of that needle, I can drop that needle, bring this yarn up so it doesn't get in my way as I turn my needle to this side, facing to the right. Now I can take these stitches, push the cable through so they sit on my needle tip on the bottom. And now again, I'm going to knit these stitches with this tip of the needle. So I'm going to pull this needle out, and with my working yarn here, I am going to start knitting these stitches. Again, I'm going to knit in the front and back of these stitches to do my increases for this first round. All right, now that I'm done with those stitches, I'm going to do the same thing. Drop that tip, turn it to the facing to the right, slide this cable through the bottom stitches onto the needle tip, pull this top out to now start row number 2. Okay, so then you can just continue to knit. If you want to keep tugging on this tail to continue to close that gap up a little bit, you can, but now you can see that I've got the startings of a knitting in the round with my long circular needles to do magic loop. Okay, so I hope you found this cast on method a great tool to use for doing top down hats or toe up socks. I did this method on this hat here where I started from the top, did a nice clean, very tight center hole here, and did this exact method I just shown you to start my circular knitting round and around, and you have just a nice clean finish at the top. If you like this video, please give me a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe. You'll receive all sorts of knitting tips and tutorial videos all about knitting stitches, techniques, and fun patterns. Thanks for watching, everybody.